The snow in that alley behind the mercantile was not white anymore. It was stained rust-red beneath a woman's trembling body. And when Marshal Thomas Whitfield found her on the first morning of 1878, he thought for one terrible heartbeat that he was looking at a corpse. If you believe in kindness, in faith, in redemption, and in the kind of second chances that only a merciful God can arrange, I ask you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe before we go on, because this story is going to ask a great deal of your heart. The town was called Prosperity Creek, though there had never been much prosperity in it, only hard winters and harder men. It sat in the Wyoming territory, tucked against the foothills where the wind came down off the mountains like a living thing with teeth, and on that New Year's morning the wind had teeth enough to freeze a man's breath to his mustache. Thomas Whitfield was 43 years old, a widower, and the town's only lawman, a man whose boots had walked more miles chasing outlaws than he cared to count, and whose heart had grown a callous over the years the way a hand grows one from gripping a rope too long. He was making his rounds before sunrise, the way he always did, checking that the saloon had finally gone quiet and that no drunken cowhand had frozen himself in a doorway when he heard the sound. It was not a scream. It was smaller than that, and somehow more terrible, a moan, thin as a thread, coming from the narrow gap between the mercantile and the harness shop. He found her curled against the wall, her dress torn at the shoulder, her dark hair matted with blood and ice, her lips the color of a bruised plum. She could not have been more than 25 years old. Thomas dropped to his knees in the snow without a thought for his own trousers and pressed 2 fingers beneath her jaw. And when he felt the faint, stubborn flutter of a pulse, something cracked open in his chest that had been sealed shut since his wife died of the fever 3 winters before. He gathered her up in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, like a bird with its wings broken, and he said the words that would change both their lives forever, though neither of them knew it yet. He said, low and rough, "Get up now, girl. You hear me? You're going home." She did not answer. She could not. But something in her seemed to hear him anyway, because her fingers curled weakly into the front of his coat, as if she were a drowning woman who had just found a rope. He carried her 3 blocks through the empty streets, past the darkened windows of the town that had not yet stirred to welcome the new year, and he brought her to Dr. Amos Pruitt's house, pounding on the door until the old physician came stumbling out in his nightshirt, spectacles askew. Dr. Pruitt took one look at her and ushered them both inside, and for the next 2 hours Thomas Whitfield sat in the hallway with his hat crushed in his hands, praying the kind of prayer a man only prays when he has run out of everything else to offer. Her name, they would learn once the fever broke enough for her to speak, was Charlotte and Bishop, and her story was one that Prosperity Creek would whisper about for years afterward, though never in her hearing, for Thomas would not allow it. She had come west from Missouri 2 years prior with a husband named Silas Bishop, a man who had promised her a homestead and a good life, and had delivered instead a shack with a leaking roof and a temper that grew shorter with every failed harvest. When the crops died the 2nd year running, Silas had taken to the bottle, and when the bottle was not enough to drown his shame, he had taken to his fists. Charlotte had endured 2 winters of that, hiding the bruises under long sleeves and telling the church ladies she had simply fallen, the way so many women of that hard country learned to lie to protect a man who did not deserve protecting. But on New Year's Eve, Silas had come home from the saloon in a rage over money lost at cards, and he had beaten her worse than ever before, and when she had finally fled into the freezing night with nothing but the dress on her back, he had thrown a whiskey bottle after her that caught her above the ear and dropped her in that alley like a discarded thing. She had crawled the last 20 yards on her hands and knees before the cold and the blood loss took her under. Dr. Pruitt said it was a miracle she had not frozen to death outright, and a greater miracle still that the blow to her skull had not killed her. He said the next few days would tell whether she lived or died, and Thomas Whitfield, who had buried his own wife and had sworn he would never again let his heart get tangled up in another person's suffering, found himself unable to leave her bedside. He told himself it was duty. He told himself a lawman was obligated to look after a crime victim until the matter was settled. But the truth, which he would not admit even to his own reflection for many weeks, was that something about her stubborn grip on his coat in that alley had reached down into the frozen ground of his heart and struck water. Charlotte lived. She woke on the 3rd day of January, disoriented and terrified, flinching so violently when Thomas leaned over her that he had to step back and speak to her the way a man speaks to a spooked horse, slow and low and steady, until she understood that the hand reaching toward her held no threat. It took her many days more to tell her story, and when she finally did, sitting up in Dr. Pruitt's spare bed with a quilt pulled to her chin and her eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance, Thomas felt an anger rise in him that he had not felt since the war, an anger that made him understand, for the first time in his career as a lawman, why some men took justice into their own hands rather than waiting on a court. He did not do that, though the temptation gnawed at him. Instead, he rode out to the Bishop homestead 3 days later with his badge pinned square on his chest and his rifle across his saddle, and he found Silas Bishop sitting on his porch with a bottle in his hand, unbothered, as though a man's wife vanishing into a snowstorm was no great concern of his. Thomas arrested him for assault, and though the territorial law of that era offered little enough protection to women in Charlotte's position, Thomas made certain that every rancher, every merchant, every soul in Prosperity Creek knew exactly what kind of man Silas Bishop was, and by the time the circuit judge came through that spring to hear the case, there was not a jury in that county who would look kindly on him. Silas was sentenced to 2 years for aggravated assault, a sentence some said was too light and others said was more than a man deserved for beating a wife who belonged to him by law and custom. But Thomas did not care what the gossips said. He cared only that Charlotte was safe, and that the door between her old life and whatever came next had been closed and bolted. What came next was not simple, because grief and fear do not vanish the moment danger passes. Charlotte had nowhere to go, no family within 1,000 miles, no money, no trade, nothing but the clothes Dr. Pruitt's wife had given her out of charity. She spoke of returning to Missouri, though she admitted she had no one waiting there either, her parents having passed years before and a brother she had not heard from since the war. She spoke of it the way a person speaks of a plan they do not truly believe in, because it is easier than admitting they have no plan at all. Thomas listened to her talk in circles for a week before he finally said the thing that had been sitting on his tongue since the morning he carried her out of that alley. He told her that his own place, a modest cattle ranch he had built with his late wife on the edge of town, had stood mostly empty and silent since her passing, that the hands who worked his herd ate their meals standing up because there was no woman's touch left in the kitchen, and that if Charlotte had nowhere else to go, she would be welcome there, not as charity and not as anything improper, but simply as a person given honest work and an honest roof until she found her footing in the world. He said it plainly, the way he said everything, without flowery words, but there was something in his voice that told Charlotte he meant it as more than politeness. She wept when he said it, not from sorrow this time, but from the shock of being offered something freely, without a debt attached, for the first time and longer than she could remember. She came to the Whitfield Ranch in the last week of January, and the first months were quiet and careful, 2 wounded people learning to move around each other without causing more pain. Charlotte threw herself into work the way a person throws themselves into a river when they are trying to outrun their own thoughts. She cooked for the ranch hands. She mended fences alongside men twice her size. She learned to ride better than most cowhands within a season, and slowly, so slowly that neither of them marked the exact day it happened, the haunted look began to fade from her eyes. Spring came to Wyoming territory the way it always did, reluctant and stubborn. Snow lingering in the shadow draws long after the prairie had turned green, and with the spring came the cattle drive season, and with the cattle drive season came trouble neither Charlotte nor Thomas had anticipated. Silas Bishop, it turned out, had friends among the rougher element of the territory, men who ran with a small gang of rustlers operating out of the Badlands to the north, and when word reached that gang that the marshal of Prosperity Creek had put one of their associates behind bars over what they considered a private matter between a man and his wife, they decided the marshal needed teaching. In April, riders came through in the night and ran off nearly 40 head of Thomas's cattle, torching the line shack where 2 of his hands slept, though thank God both men escaped with their lives. It was a clear message, and everyone in town understood it as one. Thomas rode out after the rustlers with a posse of 6 men, following the trail north into rougher country, canyon land cut through with dry washes and studded with sagebrush and juniper, the kind of country where a man could disappear forever if he knew its secrets. Charlotte begged him not to go, not out of doubt in his courage, but out of a fear she had not expected to feel again, the fear of losing someone who mattered to her. It was the first time she said it plainly, standing in the ranch yard with the morning light behind her, that she could not bear to lose him, that he had pulled her back from death itself, and she would not stand by and watch him ride toward his own. Thomas took her hands in his rough, weathered ones and told her that a man who would not stand and fight for what was right did not deserve to call himself a lawman. But he promised her, with more tenderness than he had shown any living soul since his first wife's passing, that he intended to come home to her. The chase lasted 4 days across some of the harshest country in the territory, through a spring storm that dropped hail the size of musket balls and turned the dry washes into raging brown torrents within the hour, testing every man's endurance and every horse's heart. They caught the rustlers holed up in an abandoned mining camp in the foothills, the very kind of forsaken place that had swallowed 100 failed dreams of gold. And the fight that followed was short and vicious, the kind of gunfight that Old West legend is made of, but that leaves a man's hands shaking for days afterward. Thomas took a bullet through the meat of his shoulder, but he and his posse recovered every head of stolen cattle and brought 3 rustlers back to Prosperity Creek in irons, breaking the back of that gang's operations in the territory for good. When he rode back into town, pale and bloodied but upright in the saddle, Charlotte ran to meet him in the street with no thought for propriety or what the church ladies might whisper, and she wept into his good shoulder in front of the entire town, and nobody who witnessed it ever again doubted what the marshal and the widow woman felt for one another. He recovered through the summer, slowly, with Charlotte at his side, changing bandages and reading to him from the family Bible in the evenings when his fever ran high. And it was during those long, quiet hours, with the windows open to the sound of cattle lowing in the near pasture and the smell of prairie grass on the wind, that Thomas finally worked up the nerve to ask her the question he had been carrying since New Year's morning without fully understanding it himself. He asked her to be his wife, not out of pity for what she had suffered nor obligation for what he had done, but because somewhere in the space of half a year, she had become the reason he rose each morning with something like hope in his chest again, a feeling he had thought buried forever alongside his first wife. Charlotte, who had once believed that love was only ever a prelude to pain, wept for the second time that year in front of him, but this time the tears carried no grief in them at all. They married that autumn in the small clapboard church at the edge of Prosperity Creek, with the whole town turning out despite the chill wind that had begun creeping down from the mountains once more, a wind that everyone remarked felt gentler somehow than the one that had nearly claimed Charlotte's life the winter before. Dr. Pruitt gave her away, since she had no father living to do it, and the ranch hands who had once eaten their meals standing in a silent kitchen stood now in their Sunday best, grinning like fools, because every man on that ranch had watched their marshal come back to life alongside the woman he had saved. Silas Bishop, they later learned, died in the territorial prison of a fever not unlike the one that had once threatened Charlotte's own life, a quiet and unremarkable end to a man who had brought so much suffering. And if there was any justice left to be delivered in this world beyond what the courts had already dealt him, most folks in Prosperity Creek figured the Almighty had seen to the rest. Charlotte and Thomas built a life together on that Wyoming ranch that neither of them could have imagined on the frozen morning they first met in that alley. They raised 3 children who grew up hearing the story of how their mother had been found half dead in the snow on New Year's Day, and how their father had refused to let her go. A story told not as tragedy, but as testimony, proof to those children and to everyone who ever heard it that no matter how dark a night becomes, morning does eventually come, and sometimes it comes wearing a marshal's badge and speaking in a voice rough with feeling, saying words that sound almost too simple to carry. The weight they do. Get up. You're going home. Now, before we close this story, I want to ask something of you watching tonight. Please leave a comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching this from. And tell me too what lesson this story left burning in your heart, because stories like Charlotte and Thomas's are not meant to simply be watched and forgotten. They are meant to be carried forward into our own lives, into our own moments when we might be the one called to reach down and lift someone else out of the snow. Charlotte Bishop, once a broken and forgotten woman lying in a frozen alley with nothing left to her name, became a rancher's wife, a mother, and a pillar of a town that had once nearly let her die in silence. And she never forgot. not for one single day of her long and well-lived life. The sound of a stranger's voice cutting through the New Year's dark, telling her to get up because she was going home. If this story touched something in you tonight, if it stirred your faith in kindness and in the second chances that a merciful God still places along even our darkest roads, then please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, leave your comment below, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Because the frontier may be long gone from this world, but the courage, the love, and the redemption that lived in it never has to be.